The morning fog hung thick over the shipyards of Hamburg on July 18, 1943. The rhythmic pounding of steel reverberated through the air as workers huddled together, shrouded in the gray mist of war. The clatter of machinery blended with the distant roar of air raids as the city braced for the worst. On the factory floors, German workers grimaced under the weight of their tasks, their hands calloused and scarred from the unrelenting labor required to keep the war machine churning. They were making weapons of war, tanks, aircraft, artillery, but even they could feel the immense pressure. The outcome of the war seemed increasingly uncertain, and every blow struck upon steel, every weld and rivet, carried the weight of the Nazi regime's fate. But in the back of their minds, the German workers knew something. They were the backbone of the war effort. They held the power of creation and destruction in their hands, and no one in their world would dare question that. That was, until one fateful report arrived, shattering that perception with the force of 1,000 exploding shells. The secret report from the front lines had filtered back to Berlin. The Allies, once deemed technologically inferior, had just achieved something that should have been impossible. A fleet of warships, unimaginable in their scale and sophistication, had been produced in a fraction of the time it would have taken any German factory to even assemble the steel, let alone construct the ships. These ships weren't being built by highly trained men, seasoned workers with years of experience. They were being built by American women, whose names were still unfamiliar to most of the world, but whose hands were crafting the future of warfare. U.S. Navy log, August 1943. The report described scenes that made the German workers feel as though the ground was slipping from beneath their feet. In a far-off land, hundreds of American women, many of whom had never so much as touched a wrench, were now building massive ships in the shipyards of the United States. The output was staggering. In the same span of time it took German factories to assemble the hull of a single U-boat, American women were assembling entire fleets. The sheer speed of production was so mind-boggling that even the Führer's inner circle had begun to wonder, how could this be? How could an entire nation, on the brink of economic collapse, under constant bombardment, and with an exhausted workforce, be so far outpaced in terms of industrial output by their enemies? U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The disparity between the American and German war efforts could not have been clearer. The Germans, who had prided themselves on their engineering prowess, had long assumed that the Americans could never match their speed, their efficiency, or their precision. Yet, it wasn't the vast industrial might of the U.S. that had shocked the German workers. It was the women, the mothers, daughters, and wives, who were transforming the landscape of warfare. By the end of 1943, America's shipyards would churn out more warships than the entire German Navy combined. And these ships would be built not by hardened veterans of industrial labor, but by those who had never even considered stepping into a factory before the war. U.S. Navy Report, 1944. The women who worked in these shipyards, under the harsh glare of the sun and the sound of war, were not just replacing men who had been drafted. They were creating an entirely new industrial workforce, one that would forever change the landscape of American labor and production. In places like the Kaiser Shipyards of Portland, Oregon, and the Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in California, American women were filling the shoes of the men who had left for battlefields in Europe and the Pacific. These women were assembling warships, piece by piece, as if it were nothing more than a daily task. They welded, riveted, painted, and assembled with a determination that left even the hardest German workers in disbelief at the height of the war. American women were responsible for building nearly 50% of the U.S. Navy's warships. Ships that, in another time, would have been considered the epitome of technological marvels were now being built in a fraction of the time it had taken the Germans to design and assemble their own vessels. The Germans, whose war effort had been steeled by years of meticulous planning and engineering, began to question everything they thought they knew about industrial warfare. Their inability to keep up with the Americans led to a deepening sense of frustration and shock. They had underestimated the Allies, and even worse, they had underestimated the American woman. U.S. War Production Board Report, 1943. The work in those American shipyards was not easy. It was grueling. Women labored in conditions that would make the most seasoned industrial worker cringe. The air was thick with the smell of oil, the clanging of metal echoing through the yards. Each day, they stood side by side with men, their hands raw from the work, their faces streaked with sweat, soot, and determination. They learned quickly, adapting to the skills they needed to operate the massive machinery required to construct the ships. Some women operated cranes that were designed to carry massive steel beams, while others welded the very hulls that would survive the brutal combat of the Pacific or the Atlantic. Every moment spent on that factory floor was a direct challenge to the notion of what a woman could do during wartime. But their efforts were not merely a matter of necessity. They were a symbol of resilience, of resourcefulness, and of the untapped potential of the American workforce. In cities like Los Angeles, Seattle, and Richmond, these women, often referred to as Rosie the Riveter, had become icons of the American war effort. Their strength and determination were something the world would never forget. The men of the German workforce, who had once held dominion over their factories, now faced a bitter realization. They were no longer the undisputed masters of industrial warfare. The rise of American women in the shipyards marked a dramatic shift in the balance of power, one that no amount of Nazi propaganda could undo. But the real shock for the German workers wasn't just the speed or efficiency of the Americans. It was the fact that this monumental feat was being accomplished by women who, just months before, had never considered themselves part of the industrial workforce. And as the steel of warships rolled off the American assembly lines at a pace faster than ever before, the Germans knew that the world had changed. They had underestimated not just the might of America's industrial complex, but also the will of its women, who were reshaping history in ways they could not yet comprehend. Bundesarchiv, April 1943. And so, as the battle raged on, the shipyards of America continued to hum with life. And the men in Germany, who had thought their country's industrial strength was unmatched, watched as their dreams of victory began to crumble before their very eyes. The question remained, could Germany catch up, or was it too late to stop the unstoppable force of American industrial might? U.S. Army After Action Report, December 1943. In the shadow of the shipyards, the truth behind the astonishing output of warships came to light. It wasn't just a matter of raw manpower, although that, too, was critical, but rather the systematic and ingenious application of technology and logistics that had allowed America to outpace its enemies in ways no one had ever imagined. The true secret weapon of the American industrial effort was not just its workers, but the very tools they wielded: innovations in machinery, precision production, and a supply chain system that kept the wheels of war turning at full speed. And at the heart of this revolution were the women who, once thrust into the factories, harnessed the power of these tools and redefined what was possible. As the war progressed, the U.S. was in a race against time. The Axis powers, chiefly Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, had launched devastating strikes across the globe, threatening to reshape the balance of power in Europe and the Pacific. The American industrial complex, however, had one critical advantage: its ability to mass-produce warships at an unparalleled rate. American shipyards were producing aircraft carriers, destroyers, and battleships not just in hundreds, but in the thousands. By 1944, the U.S. Navy would have more warships in service than all the other nations combined. And what was once seen as an unthinkable task, filling those yards with metal, sweat, and the efforts of women, became the turning point in the Allied war effort. U.S. War Production Board, 1944. A key element in this surge of production was the development and use of the Liberty ship. These vessels, created to meet the staggering demands of wartime logistics, were designed to be produced at an unprecedented rate. They were cargo ships, capable of carrying the supplies needed to fuel the Allied advance across the world. But to understand the significance of the Liberty ships, one must first understand the scale at which they were produced. These ships were being constructed in record time, often in as little as 30 days, a timeline that left German engineers and industrialists astounded. The Liberty ship, for all its simplicity, was a technical marvel of mass production. Bureau of Ships Report, 1943. The concept of mass production was not new, of course. The Ford Model T had introduced the world to the efficiency of assembly lines. But the Liberty ship was a far more complex beast. The sheer volume of metal that needed to be turned into a vessel capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo across the Atlantic or Pacific was daunting. Yet, under the hands of American women, this ship, and many like it, began to take shape with startling speed. It was here that the true advantage of American industry came into play. While German and Japanese warships were often painstakingly designed, with long lead times and complex specifications, American engineers, led by innovators such as Henry J. Kaiser, adapted an assembly line approach to shipbuilding. The resulting design for the Liberty ship was simple, effective, and, crucially, fast. Kaiser Shipyard Records, 1943. The Liberty ship's specifications were straightforward. It was 441 feet long, weighed 10,500 tons, and was powered by a steam turbine capable of reaching speeds of 11 knots. While not the fastest vessel in the ocean, it was an unstoppable juggernaut of industrial effort. And it was these ships that formed the backbone of the Allied logistical chain. The Germans had no answer to this new form of mass production. Their U-boats and battleships, meticulously designed and crafted by their engineers, could not compete with the speed of construction that the Americans had achieved. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Women, who were often pushed into the workforce as part of the war effort, found themselves at the forefront of this industrial revolution. Many of them had no prior experience in factory work. Some had never even held a tool. But under the guidance of skilled supervisors and the power of the assembly line, these women became key players in the American industrial effort. They operated the tools, welded the hulls, and riveted the steel. The speed and efficiency with which they worked not only stunned the Germans, but also became a symbol of what was possible when the entire nation's resources were focused on a single goal. U.S. War Production Board Report, 1943. As the war raged on, the importance of the Liberty ship and its sisters, the Victory ship, the T-2 tanker, and others, became clearer. The ships weren't just symbols of industrial might. They were the lifeblood of the Allied campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. As the Axis powers pushed harder and harder, the Allies responded not just with military might, but with an industrial edge that left their enemies scrambling to catch up. For every U-boat the Germans produced, the Americans were building 2 or 3 Liberty ships to carry the supplies needed to keep the war effort going. And for every setback in the Pacific, the U.S. Navy could rely on a continuous supply of fresh ships, keeping them in the fight longer than their Japanese counterparts. U.S. Army Logistics Report, 1944. The Germans, who had prided themselves on their engineering superiority, were now at a distinct disadvantage. The American production lines, which had initially appeared clumsy and inefficient to their foreign counterparts, were now the epitome of industrial warfare. And it wasn't just the machines themselves that had made the difference. The American approach to logistics, pioneered by figures like William S. Knudsen, ensured that the raw materials, steel, aluminum, and fuel, flowed into the factories in a steady stream. The efficiency of American transport networks allowed for rapid distribution of goods, something the Germans could never quite replicate. U.S. Logistics Command, 1944. This discrepancy in industrial capacity began to manifest on the battlefield. The Germans, unable to keep up with the production demands, began to see their fleets shrink, while the Americans saw theirs grow faster than ever. The most telling moment came during the Battle of the Atlantic, where U-boats that had once dominated the waters were now facing a constant supply of Allied ships, faster than they could sink them. As each new convoy of Liberty ships arrived in Europe, the pressure on the Axis forces mounted. And the women who had built those ships, often with sweat on their brows and grit in their hearts, were now the unsung heroines of the war effort. U.S. Navy After Action Report, 1944. But the speed of production came at a price. Despite the technological marvels of mass production, American shipyards were still vulnerable to sabotage, mechanical breakdowns, and supply shortages. And yet, it was in this environment of constant stress and adversity that the women of America, with their resilience and ingenuity, proved themselves indispensable. Their work went far beyond simply filling a gap left by men. They had become an integral part of the war effort, not only ensuring that the ships were built, but also that the very idea of victory was within reach. Women in the War Report, 1944. As the war turned in favor of the Allies, the Germans began to take note. The very industry they had once thought invincible was now dwarfed by the sheer scale of American production. And as the Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific in ever-increasing numbers, it was clear that the Allied victory was not just a matter of strategy or firepower. It was the result of an industrial revolution, fueled by the unexpected force of American women, that had reshaped the very nature of warfare itself. Bundesarchiv, June 1944. As the tide of the war shifted in favor of the Allies, the sheer scale of America's industrial victory had far-reaching implications, both on the battlefield and within the psyche of the enemy. The American women who had built the warships and supplied the Allied forces were not merely part of a wartime production effort. They had become symbols of resilience and hope, embodying a new kind of warfare that would extend far beyond the 1940s. The efficiency with which the U.S. was producing warships had a ripple effect that shaped everything from military strategy to post-war doctrine, influencing global power dynamics for decades to come. The psychological impact on the Axis powers was profound. Nazi Germany had long prided itself on its industrial capabilities. Its factories, steeped in a tradition of precision engineering, were seen as the backbone of the war effort. But by 1944, German commanders were stunned to realize that the U.S. had not only caught up with them industrially, but had surpassed them in speed and scale. The Liberty ships, each one rolling off the American assembly lines with astounding regularity, were a testament to a production machine that Germany simply could not match. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The Allies, in contrast, had managed to build up not only their military strength but also their industrial base at an unprecedented pace. The war that had been waged with tanks and planes now became a war of logistics, where the side that could sustain its production the longest would inevitably prevail. And it was here, in the shadow of American factories, that the Axis powers realized they had miscalculated. For the Germans, the speed and scale of American production seemed almost impossible. How could they have underestimated the resolve of the American workforce, particularly the women who were now integral to that effort? Bundesarchiv, 1944. It was during these final years of the war that the concept of total industrial war truly took shape. The United States did not simply outproduce Germany. It redefined the relationship between industry and warfare. Every Liberty ship that left the yard, every new aircraft that was rolled off the assembly line, was a direct answer to the growing threat posed by the Axis. The battle for the seas, in which the U-boats had once ruled, was now a fight between the past and the future. Germany, with its tightly controlled and centralized economy, had created machines of war with unmatched precision, but it was the American industrial machine, running on the power of mass production and ingenuity, that would eventually turn the tide. U.S. Navy Log, 1944. By the summer of 1944, it was clear that the Allies had secured an unassailable position in both the Pacific and European theaters. The ability to produce ships at a scale and speed never before imagined was no longer a tactical advantage. It was a strategic one. American forces were now able to sustain prolonged engagements, outlasting the Axis in critical battles like the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boats had once had the upper hand. No longer were the Germans able to strike fear into the hearts of Allied sailors and merchants. The constant influx of American-built warships ensured that the Allies would never be short of resources. U.S. Army Logistics Report, 1944. The effects of this industrial juggernaut were not just confined to the immediate post-war period. The psychological impact on the Axis was matched by a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. The United States, having outproduced the rest of the world, emerged from the war not only as a military superpower but also as an industrial titan. By 1945, the U.S. had built over 2,700 Liberty ships, vessels that would carry vital supplies across oceans, sustain front lines, and outlast the war. For the Axis, especially Germany and Japan, it was the dawning realization that the U.S. had achieved industrial and logistical supremacy. In the harsh light of post-war analysis, it became evident that no matter how brilliant the German military strategies or how well-crafted their weapons, they had failed to match the scale of American production. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The wartime legacy of these women, the Rosie the Riveters, would transcend the factories where they had worked. They had been part of an industrial revolution, one that would lay the foundation for the post-war economic boom. America's capacity for production, be it for war or peace, would establish it as the preeminent economic power in the world. The shift toward an industrial military complex, fueled by mass production and spearheaded by the efforts of women in factories, would influence the structure of post-war economies, particularly during the Cold War. U.S. War Production Board Report, 1945. In the years following the war, the world would see how these technological advancements, born from necessity, would shape future conflicts. The lessons of World War II, particularly those learned from the mass production of warships, would inform military strategies in later conflicts such as the Korean War and Vietnam War, where logistics and industrial capacity again played a decisive role. But perhaps the most significant impact of the war effort was not just in the machinery of war. It was in the people who had been forged in the fires of those factories. The women who had been part of the workforce were now positioned as equal partners in America's industrial and social fabric. The war had transformed the role of women in American society, opening doors that would forever change the landscape of work, gender, and industry. U.S. Census Bureau, 1950. In addition to its industrial achievements, the war also had a profound impact on military doctrine. The success of the American production model during World War II would have lasting effects on how nations approached warfare in the years to come. The importance of maintaining industrial flexibility, the ability to shift production capacity at a moment's notice, would be reflected in Cold War policies. The idea that speed defeats armor, once a lesson learned from the massive Allied industrial effort, would reverberate into the future, emphasizing the role of logistics and production in modern warfare. U.S. Army Logistics Manual, 1951. The psychological toll on the Axis forces, in particular Germany, was stark. They had believed in their engineering superiority, only to watch as a nation they had underestimated surpass them in the most fundamental aspect of warfare, the ability to produce and sustain. As German generals reflected on their losses, many cited the overwhelming industrial output of the United States as a decisive factor in their defeat. Bundesarchiv, 1945. The story of these women, who had been thrust into the world of factories and shipyards, was not just one of necessity, it was one of transformation. From unassuming housewives to skilled workers, they had become the unsung heroes of World War II. The war, in many ways, had forged them into symbols of the modern industrial age, where human ingenuity and machine power could rewrite the course of history. As the dust settled and the war ended, it became clear this was the new face of warfare, and the women who had built those ships had forever altered the landscape of both industry and conflict. U.S. War Production Board, 1945. In conclusion, the impact of the American industrial effort, spearheaded by women in the shipyards, was nothing short of revolutionary. The Allied victory was not just a result of battlefield tactics or military strategy. It was a victory of industrial might, of speed, and of the human will to overcome. And the women who had worked tirelessly to build the warships, to supply the troops, and to turn the tide off were left behind a legacy that still reverberates today. The lessons learned during World War II about the power of industrial production, logistical supremacy, and the unyielding human spirit would continue to shape the world for generations to come. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946.